Hello, today we're going to be going over chapter 1 and I'm going to be talking through the PowerPoint slides. As I go through these PowerPoint slides, I'm going to go through them very quickly. I'm really here just to kind of add some detail and explain some things that maybe the book doesn't or the PowerPoint slides don't do. So these presentations will be fairly quick. As I stated, we're going through chapter 1. This chapter is really going to look at all the concepts and theories that we're going to explore throughout the next 6 weeks. So you can go ahead and click to the next slide, which is of the American flag. And really, what sports and sociology examines is the deeper issues of what's going on within society and how it relates to sports and vice versa. So we're not just going to look at the surface level stuff, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into a lot of the different issues. So using sociology to study sports, and there's two key terms here. There's sociology, which is studying the social worlds that people create and maintain. So when you think of a social world, I would like to compare it to like Wartburg. Wartburg is a social world, and we maintain it, and we have relationships with each other here, and they're all different. So there's a social world. It discusses its sphere of everyday actions and relationships. Household, they say a soccer team, an athletic department, and obviously a university. Go ahead to the next slide. So go ahead and get all these up. Sociology provides concepts and theories and research methods. Typically throughout this next 6 weeks, we're just going to look at concept and theories. The research methods, isn't something that we're super concerned with. We'll touch on it a little bit, but I really want you to understand the theories and concepts and the tools that we'll need to utilize. Go ahead to the next slide. So here are 3 major concepts that you're going to see throughout the entire 6 weeks. So first one is culture. So when you're defining culture, as it says here, it's a shared way of life, an understanding that people develop as they live together. So again, let's go back to our example of Wartburg. So Wartburg, okay, what is our culture like here at Wartburg? And as I'm asking you this question, can you jot down some ideas? What is our understanding as we live together on this campus? How is that different than, maybe like a University of Iowa? Our culture here is very different. The next key term is social interaction. So how do we interact with each other? We take into account other people's feelings and thoughts and actions. That's our social interaction and how we act. So, one thing I always say is like, how do we socially interact at the Mensa? What are some rules and guidelines and things that you don't even think about, but that's what you do at the Mensa? Social structure, the established patterns of relationships, the social arrangements that shape the people live, work, and play with each other. Again, what are those patterns? What do they look like? Let's go back to work. Who do people associate with? What clubs and teams and social groups are there, and what does that look like? Go ahead to the next slide. So sociology knowledge is based on research and theory. This is a very wordy slide, but essentially it just is talking about, a lot of the things that we're going to explore aren't always something that you see or hear about. There's a lot of myths that we are going to essentially debunk this next 6 weeks. And, there's a lot of conversations out there, but it's just that surface level stuff again, where when we're going to kind of examine these, we're going to be looking at it with facts and theories and not just opinions. Okay? Go ahead to the next slide. So, in order for us to kind of dive into this, one of the first things most people would say is, what's the definition of sports? How do you define it? Well, first and foremost, it's very difficult to define sports. Everybody has a little bit different meaning, again, based on their culture, their social interaction, what environment they're in. As this slide points out, the definition of sports, and as the book discussed, is a well-established, officially governed competition physical activities in which participants are motivated by internal and external rewards. Again, it's difficult to define sports, though, because not everything fits under this model. And you could probably think of some really good examples right now, and I would be interested to hear what some of those examples are that some people may constitute as sports, but doesn't fall under this definition. Go ahead to the next slide. So now we're going to be talking about play versus dramatic spectacle. So play, how they define it is an expression activity for its own sake. So you just do it, and the results are more internal rewards. where dramatic spectacle is a performance. It is meant to entertain, to get people excited, and it's really for the sake of obtaining external rewards. So when you're sitting here listening to this, think of some examples of play. Think of some examples of dramatic spectacle and how you've seen those in your everyday life. Go ahead to the next slide. So the pros and cons of really giving a precise definition to sports. So the pros are it allows sports to distinguish from other activities. So if you really give it, hey, this is what a sport is, then you can kind of divide things. You can say this is a sport, this is not a sport. It provides a common focus for people who are doing research. So as we are exploring all of these all these activities, if we know exactly, well, this is a sport, then we don't even have to talk about some of these other things. The cons to this kind of approach, though, is privileged people with resources organize competitive games and interest in doing so. So one thing we're going to see all semester is that people who are in power get to make a lot of decisions. And what this is saying here is that powerful people essentially are the ones who are in control of competitive sports. So there could still be something that would constitute as a sport, but these people aren't putting it into that category. I hope that makes sense. Overlooks those without resources and means to compete. So when you have this really small definition of sports, it leaves out a whole group of people that are participating in things, and it really is a lot of exclusion. Go ahead to the next slide. So alternative approaches to defining sports determine the activities that people are excited about within a society. So instead of just looking at each thing, look at the community. What are they doing? What are they interested in? What are they competing in? And then define it in such a way. Determine whose sports are most strongly supported and funded, and especially with public facilities and money. So see, again, where is the excitement at? Where are people drawn to? Where are their interests? Go ahead to the next slide. Current research in sociology of sports focuses on a physical culture, which, as it says here, includes movement, physical activity, social world. So it's a really big compass, if you will. Go ahead to the next slide. So official definitions of sports, these vary from one social world to another. They list things here like how the Olympic Committee defines sports is different than the NCAA, which is different than high school activities, and so on. So again, we go back to these social worlds and things. It just depends on the environment that they are in. Go ahead to the next slide. So there's a picture here of cheerleaders, and cheer and dance. Those are one areas that some people would define as sports and others would say it is not. So again, what defines a sport? What do you have to do? There's plenty of individuals who feel passionate that what cheerleaders are doing is, physically active and really takes talent, and there's competition. So by those definitions, then yes, it should be a sport. But as it points out here, cheerleading is not considered a sport in the college level. So those are some, interesting things for you to think about. The next slide talks about sports and society. So sports as part of a society are what this defines here, and it's important for you to understand this, are social constructions, okay, that give meaning and form, giving form and meaning by people as they interact with each other under social, political, and economic conditions that exist in society. So all this slide is saying is that sports are a part of society, and the importance of sports or the meaning we give to them depends on the environment that they are in, the people that are in that environment. So again, if I were to give you an example, we could have a high school who thinks of sports and gives a meaning to sports very differently than Wartburg. We could have two different colleges. So we could have Wartburg and college, Smith over here. They give different meaning to sports as well. So it really depends on the environment. Go ahead to the next slide. So sports are social constructs. This kind of just continues to give some definition to that. The main thing I want you to take away from this slide is that meaning gives means to sports can take different forms and be given different meanings from one situation, one culture to the next. So I just gave you a broad example, Wartburg and Smith College, but another way to look at it is within Wartburg. So there could be different teams that have different views and give different meaning to sports. There could be different clubs that, it just really depends on the individuals. Go ahead to the next slide. So sports are contested activities. So this means that there are struggles within sports. So people struggle over meaning, the purpose, and how to organize sport. And we're going to see this throughout the whole 6 weeks. How should we do things? What's the best way to do things? How does it affect others? People allowed to play sports and under the conditions that they're allowed to play. So who gets to play? Who gets the opportunities to play? And right away, you're going to say to yourself, as I was growing up, anybody could play. But there's a lot that goes into that. And you're going to learn that it's not as easy as we think to have access to sports. And, what type of individuals get access to what kind of sports. People are the people and organizations that sponsor and provide resources needed to sports. So there's some real disconnect there on, how they should be organized, who should sponsor them, who should pay for them, where the resources should come from. Go ahead to the next slide. The sociology of sport, it's a subdiscipline that studies sports as a part of social life and culture. So for us, we're really going to be examining a lot of diversity issues. My goal is for you to leave more open-minded and have a better understanding of how our culture works by looking through it through sports. Focus primarily on the organization and competitive sports, and then we'll ask critical questions about sports and society. Go ahead to the next slide. So the great sports myth, we'll look at this quite a bit. This might be a little gut-wrenching for you. There's this idea that sports are essentially perfect. They're pure, they're good, they teach wonderful life skills, and there's really no need to study it because they're great. Like, why wouldn't you participate in some capacity in sports? And, changing them would only hurt their purity, if you will. Go to the next slide. So one thing I want to make sure you understand is the difference between sociology versus psychology. And, this really isn't a sociology class, and by no means is this a psychology class, but I want you to have an understanding of how we're looking at this a little bit differently. So sociology, we're going to study the relationships and the social context in which people live in. So we're going to look at our society, and we're going to discuss issues and how we live them. Psychologists study the behaviors and in terms of attributes and processes that exist in each individual. So I hope you make sure you have an understanding of the differences between the two. Go on to the next slide. Okay, so sociology may create controversy. Let's just talk about the bottom part. Those who benefit from the status quo. So when we say status quo, the norm, which we'll get into later, are usually threatened by such findings that may discredit or ignore them. So what that's saying is as we're doing research, the people who are in power, they like how things are. I mean, that's why they don't want it to change. It fits their needs. So when you start to do research and you start to have these discussions and we start challenging it, people don't like that. They don't want to see that change. Again, we'll get into that more throughout the next 6 weeks. Go on to the next slide. Sports are a social phenomena. Sports are related to social and contexts in which we live. Sports provide stories and images and, really kind of evaluate how we live and explains how things are happening. They also provide a window into our culture and society, and that's really important. So sports, so think about in the United States. If you didn't live here and you came and you started to kind of learn about our sports culture, you would learn a lot about our society. What do we value? What does our makeup look like? What kind of things are important to us? What do we value? You would learn a lot, and we're going to discuss all of those. Go ahead to the next slide. So why are we studying sports? I mean, this is IS 201. We're looking at, living in a diverse world. So why are we studying sports? Well, a couple different reasons that we have listed here. Sports are super significant in our society. As I told you earlier, whether you like it or not, you're going to be around sports the rest of your life. Whether it's, people talking about the Super Bowl, or there's going to be work leagues of softball and volleyball, or, potentially if you have kids or niece and nephew someday, they may be involved. It's always going to be around you. Sports, as you're going to see here, reaffirm important ideas and beliefs, including ideologies. And we're going to touch on what the word ideology really means here in a second. Sports are integrated into major spheres of social life. So family, economy, media, politics, education, and religion. Let me say that again. Sports are integrated to all of those major spheres of your life. Family, economy, the media, politics, education, and religion. So there's not one of those sections that sports